wanted to thank everybody for coming. I teach a required American history survey class, so for me it's a huge treat to be in a room full of people who are not required to be here. I hope you're not required to be here. It's a thrill. And for that I wanted to thank Julie Baca of KOPN. And in absentia, to thank Sarah Gruen for having written such an exciting book that everybody wanted to read it and talk about it more. And also to thank Julie for having the idea of talking about food in this novel, because as she said, I'm really, really interested in food and history, and to be given the opportunity to read a novel looking for food and history was just a treat to me. And then to get to talk about it with people who actually might be interested. Again, very exciting. So what I wanted to do first is to kind of point out where I saw food in the book, and not just when I was eating a sandwich and spilled something in the book. That sounds funny. But where I see food in the plot, where I see it kind of moving the plot forward, and then obviously you guys will have seen it in other places, and you should just raise your hands and throw that in as well. And then I wanted to talk about food during the Depression, which, as I told people that I was coming out here to give this talk, everyone in my department said, food in the Depression, there wasn't any, go home, you know, what are you going to talk about? And in fact, the problem was that there was food, but it couldn't get to the people, so we'll talk about that. And responses to scarcity. What did ordinary people do? What did the government do? And then what did the little coterie of people dearest to my heart, the home economists, do? And they did some really, really interesting stuff that I think will surprise you. Okay, and I also, the last thing was that I hope that some of you have brought stories about food during the Depression. I found, again, as I was talking about coming out here, that everybody that I spoke to in New York said, oh, my grandfather had this story, oh, my family has this story, that it really changed the way that Americans think about food. So I think it's an interesting topic, and I hope some of you will join in with your stories too. Okay, from the very first page in this book, there's food. We begin with a hamburger in somebody's mouth. Jacob is about to eat this greasy hamburger, and he doesn't eat it because something strange happens, and you all know what that thing was, right? But we don't quite know, right? So the story is sort of suspended until the end in the way that the hamburger is just about to be bitten into and never gets eaten. So I think it's a really nice parallel that Sarah Gruen sets up there with the hamburger about to be eaten and the story about to happen, right? The beginning of Jacob's second life in a way. So this is the first moment when I noticed food in the book, right on the first page. And then I noticed that it establishes the social order within the circus, that the food tent is where the hierarchy of the circus is. Jacob has to eat with August and Marlena, even though this is very uncomfortable to him. But where you eat, as much as what you eat, really matters, I think. As I started writing this, I started thinking about various jobs I've had in my life and where I ate my lunch and what that said about the kind of place it was, and how today lots of people eat at their desk, and it's very important to be seen, you know, I'm not taking time out for food, I'm not having pleasure during the day, I'm just sitting here eating my lunch at my desk. And you know that it from high school cafeterias all the way up to the White House, where you sit when you eat really seems to matter to people. So I think it's important to think about that in the book as well. Also the fact that everybody is tied to the circus because they need to eat, right? That this wouldn't be so true in the 1950s when there were a lot of other things people could be doing to get food, but the fact that they're going to get fed is what keeps them there. Remember, they're not even being paid most of the time. They just have that food tent to keep coming back to. Really, like, it's a gravy train, essentially, that circus train that they all want to be on. So they put up with this horrendous treatment and this very strange traveling life to get fed during the Depression, which is very, very important. Another thing that I noticed was that food within the story, food is a kind of a medium for chicanery, you know, for fooling people, basically. There's the lemonade that it doesn't even have real lemons in it, that has these fake lemons bouncing around, and that's another way to think about food as a way people sort of fool themselves about stuff. I saw a pie competition on television recently, and these pies were like piled high with meringue and whipped cream, and well, that's not really the pie, but that's the kind of the symbol of pie that people are putting out there. There's also, food comes into the story of old Jacob. It's really, really important to him. If you remember, he's disgusted with the food in the cafeteria, and again with where he has to sit and who he's going to sit with while he eats. He bonds with his aide, his nurse's aide, Rosemary, because she brings him food. She shares with him her food. And it's so interesting, what she shares with him is this fresh fruit that she bought because she's on a diet. And just to sort of remind ourselves that food is something that we don't just eat, that it's something that we sort of punish ourselves with or to reward ourselves with as well. Again, thinking about those huge pies, piled high with extra stuff. And the way that he knows that, well, there are two ways that he knows that the new old guy, I should say, who's brought into the nursing home is a phony. The one way is he says he brought water for elephants, which is feeding an elephant, right? And the other way is that he eats the food and he seems to enjoy it, and he doesn't seem to have this kind of, this discrimination, this palate that Jacob kind of prides himself on, that's something that keeps him alive, that ability to taste, to know what's good food and what's not good food. And again, that this is a way that he can establish his own identity by not eating institutional food, and a way that Rosemary, the nurse's aide, can help him be free, really, by giving him food from outside. So I can't really see you guys very well. Where did you guys notice food? No? No food at all?
Here's one over here.
Yeah.
The food they gave the tigers.
Yes, right?
The rotten with the maggots and all that.
Yeah, it's disgusting. You can't help but notice this, right? And you can almost, she writes so well, you can almost smell this, but you don't want to do at all. Yeah, it's a very sensory book.
Yeah, and at a time when food was so scarce for the animals as well as the people.
Yeah, you think that at that time, maybe those scraps, somebody could have done something with them almost. Yeah. Right. So there's this constant need in the circus to feed the big cats. And to do that, after Silver Streak, yeah, right. After he gets injured, is it a he? I can't remember. A he, okay. Not good with horse genders. So when Silver Streak is injured, they feed him to the big cats because they have to keep these cats fed, because the cats are the part of the draw of the circus, the most exotic part of the circus. So I started looking around to see, what did zoos do, right? What did a zoo do during the Depression? And I found a couple of really interesting stories. One is that in Detroit, there were rumors, and rumors are always, you're never sure as a historian whether a rumor is worth repeating. But there were rumors that the people of Detroit were so upset that the animals in the zoo were continuing to be fed when the people of Detroit were going hungry, that they started to mutter about getting into the zoo and eating the animals. So that rather than letting the tigers keep getting fed, they would eat the tigers, which is such a wonderful idea. I think those ferocious people of Detroit. And then this other really beautiful story that it sort of parallels the Silver Streak story. In the what is the zoo called? The Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. They were going through tough times, and a summer camp donated an old horse who I guess was too old even for little kids to ride around. So they donated this horse to the zoo and said, here, take this horse, you can feed your animals with it. And somebody who worked at the zoo had known the horse before in his life as a camp counselor. And he rescued the horse. He said, no, you can't feed that horse to anybody. He took the horse home and somehow fed it himself, which is a nice redeeming story after the horrible story of Silver Streak's fate. Another kind of ominous memo. This is from the park board at Woodland Park Zoo from 1933. The park board had a meeting, and at the meeting they moved that superfluous and uninteresting animals be disposed of. And they should be disposed of, obviously, by being fed to more interesting animals. And we don't know, there's no list of who got cut up, but you can imagine. It was domestic animals, animals that people didn't, you have to imagine these animals were, if they knew what was going on, they were all kind of overperforming to make sure that they were not get fed to more interesting animals. It's a very, very brutal world. So where else? Anywhere else that you see food? I can think of more myself, but I hate to hog. What? The food tent, yeah, exactly, right? And the quality of food, that there's the food tent for the kind of roustabouts, and then the food tent for the artists as well. yeah, that they're fed different things is really, really interesting. And that, that they're able to get liquor as well. And until 1933, this was a real problem for people who wanted to get drunk, which a lot of people did probably during the early days of the Depression. And they're able to do this. I think it's very clever of her to put this in that they kind of swoop up near Canada or through Canada, I can't remember, but they get close enough to Canada to just kind of load up with booze and then continue on. And sometimes when we think about food, we forget that drink is also part of that. And especially alcohol that August uses as a kind of, how do you say this, as a way to assert his authority over Jacob, that he can supply him with alcohol and with the steaks and the lavish kinds of meals that anyone would die for during the Depression, or die from not having, I guess. There's also the issue of the food for the elephant herself, that the big problem is that she eats so much, and she's not bringing in anything in the beginning, right? She's not paying for her keep. And then at the end of the circus period of Jacob's life, that he has an elephant on his hands, right? Yeah, he ends that part of the story with an elephant to feed, which is a really difficult place to leave one of your characters. I'm sure a lot of you have read about her process of writing, that she likes to get her characters into impossible situations and then find them a way out of it. And I mean, what could be worse than giving someone an elephant to feed? It's a great, great story. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what happened with food during the Depression. And it's sort of interesting given what's happening to agriculture today. I think it's a little bit revealing. Before the Depression started, so it was far back as about 1900, there was this big shift in American agriculture from subsistence family farming, where you grew what your family needed, and then you had a little extra. You sold this for, things like sugar, extra stuff, things you couldn't grow on your own farm. So there's this shift from family farming to single crop farms. So there's this this move to go from the small farm to the bigger farm where you're just growing one thing. And you've all heard of the phrase, go big or get out. And this is exactly what happened to American farmers. Those that could afford to mortgage their land in order to buy more land and in order to buy the equipment to work those bigger pieces of land. So by the time 1929 comes along, a lot of farmers are in a very precarious position. They're in debt. And on top of that, they're growing one thing, and that one thing may not be something that feeds a family at all. And then, what makes things worse, ironically, is that the years 1929 to 1934 were great years agriculturally in America. So they're producing lots and lots and lots, but they can't get it to anybody. Because by this point, if you produce a lot of stuff, your prices are going to go down, and it becomes impossible for farmers to get their goods to market at a price that will pay for them having gotten them to market. So they have to keep stuff back, which then means the farmers are in trouble, and it means that the consumers are in trouble too, because they can't get what's out there. And meanwhile, of course, this industrial depression has hit, and so for a lot of people, they don't have any money to buy what is there, what's getting to them. So there's this huge problem of distribution that happens, that deepens during the Depression, and this is why people are going hungry. The organized responses to what happens originally, in the beginning, community groups, charities, religious groups would hand out money, and then so many people are coming that they don't have enough money to hand out, so they start handing out food. But this is experienced as really humiliating to people to be given food, even though they need it. It's too hard for a lot of people to go and get the food. The charity groups are setting up commissaries to give out food, and this annoys the grocers. How can you set up these kind of competition places to us and you're not even charging? And another problem with the relief supplies, the bags of food that are being given out, is that they're given out to families. So if you're a single person, if you're a single man, you're a single woman, you're not connected to a family in any way, you can't get these relief supplies. And this is why, if you look at images, there are a lot of great photos that are taken of bread lines and lines at soup kitchens, and you'll see almost always single men standing on the lines. A few single women, kind of intrepid souls, but mostly single men. And this is partly because only because single men don't have access to relief supplies, and partly because this became a way for men who were out of work to still keep that gender role of the provider. Like, I'll go to the soup kitchen, I'll get some soup, I'll get some bread, and I'll bring that home to my family, and that means I'm still a man. So there's this effort to maintain that role in the midst of a crisis, which is really destroying that kind of gender role. So there are the charity responses. I have a colleague who told about his family who were, his father was a small boy during the Depression, and they were migrant workers. They just traveled all over America. All 6 siblings were born in different states. And everywhere they went as migrant workers, they found that they could get fed by Catholic groups. So nuns would show up to feed them, essentially. And what they would be fed everywhere they went was ketchup sandwiches. Just white bread and ketchup. It doesn't sound very good, although now nutritionists will tell you that at least they're getting their lysopenes, right, from the tomato. But they didn't know about lysopenes then. So this is what they got, and they're so grateful for this that the entire family converted and are till, today they're still Catholics, because these were the people who fed them in the field. So this had a really profound effect on his family. Eventually, the private charities are going to run out of resources. They're just not going to be able to feed people. The federal government gets involved, and by 1933, they've got a really interesting plan to redistribute what surplus there is. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about what individual people did. A lot of them starved, essentially. The numbers of people who showed up at hospitals malnourished or actually in starvation just grew and grew and grew throughout the Depression. And these are just the numbers of people who went to hospitals, right? So we know that the numbers were a lot bigger, particularly because in this period, the 1920s into the 1930s, people really didn't go to hospitals who weren't going to die, who didn't think they were going to die. If you were just sick, the doctor came to your house or you went to his office. But to show up at a hospital meant that you were really, really desperate, and you didn't expect really to get out of the hospital ever. So we know that the numbers of people who actually starved are a lot larger than that. And you can find them if you look in old small town newspapers from this period, from the 1930s. You will find stories, as I have found these stories, of people who were found, so-and-so and so-and-so found in their house starved, and they just couldn't make it, and they couldn't ask for help, partly because nobody could give them help, and partly because of pride often. Another interesting response to the Depression, which I think is kind of regaining currency now as we think about local food more, is the art of foraging, of going out and finding what can be eaten everywhere, anywhere that you are. People ate anything. They ate dandelions. Here's a list of a family. Where are they? Oh, here, okay. This is a mining family from Kentucky. Some nice social worker sort of person came by and asked them what they had been eating. And they said violet tops, wild onions, forget-me-not, wild lettuce, and also whatever weeds cows would eat, because they figured that cows wouldn't eat anything poisonous. So if they saw cows eating it, they figured it was okay for them. And today maybe you could find, if you go to your local green market, you could find some of these things and pay quite a lot of money to add them to your salad. But for this family, that was it. It's a family in Philadelphia who, they'd go on relief, and then in Philadelphia, people would be dropped from relief periodically and for no reason except that the relief agency had to drop them to survive, and then they could reapply, so it's sort of a welfare situation. So this family, in between times when they were on relief, they survived on dandelion leaves. In the cities, in urban areas, this is particularly a way to get by was to go to local parks, find berries. People ate bark. They made soups out of bark. Does anyone know the story, that book by Tilly Olson called Yonandio? It's a wonderful book about her family during the Depression. Really, really beautiful book. And there's a great part in it where they're living in Chicago and their mother can't feed them, so she just takes them on this walk and they just pick stuff and eat it along the way. But again, something to think about. You can survive by foraging, at least for a little while. Smuggling was a big thing, a big way to feed your family. If you had a job, especially if you had a job in a food industry, or if you had a job in somebody else's household, you could bring food home. A woman whose father worked in a Chinese restaurant during the Depression said that he brought home fried noodles so much, so often, that she could never eat them again. And then he got a job in a cereal factory, and he brought home cornflakes, and only cornflakes, and she could never eat those again. So this really, for some people, it really changed the way that they ate. The same colleague who had the ketchup sandwich family, as they were migrant workers, occasionally they would end up working on onion farms. And they would, if they could get some bread from the nuns and some butter, which was very, very hard to come by, they would make onion sandwiches. And this friend's father, who had grown up as a child eating these onion sandwiches during the Depression, still ate them for the rest of his life. My friend said every couple of weeks he would sit down for an onion sandwich and he would really enjoy it, because to him it had become the essence of deliciousness, the rare treat. Whereas for this other woman, the Chinese noodles and the cornflakes were just reminders of hardship. So in that way, I think people who ate through the Depression, it really changed the way that they think about food. And stretching, of course, this is the one thing we can't forget. Stretching as a way to get by meant things like something called gravy soup, which if you all want to make it at home, I can give you a recipe. You brown some flour, and then you add some water, and there's your soup. Or a wonderful concoction called water sandwich, where you take a piece of bread and you soak it in lard and water. And I'm not sure how the sandwich part comes in, but there you go, something to eat. And then in 1933, the home economists at Cornell came out with the ultimate stretching device. And this was a thing, here I wish I had a blackboard so I could write it up, a substance called milk orno. So it was milk and corn together. And then the O for fun, I guess, milk orno. And they also had milk guido and milk odo. And these were mixtures of powdered milk and various kinds of oat flour or corn flour or wheat flour, and then added stuff. They'd only really just discovered vitamins, so they just kind of added in things that would be good for you. So this is supposed to be a way to eat cheaply and nutritiously, and nutrition was really a very new idea at the time, in the 1930s. So they create this stuff, milk orno, milk guido, milk odo, and they don't patent it, they make it available so everybody can produce it, and they think this is it, right? This is going to save the world. It's not only going to feed people during the Depression, but it's going to completely change the way everybody eats, right? They're just going to eat this stuff because this is what's good for them, and they're going to like it. And there are these recipes they come up with to trick you into eating milk orno. One of my favorites, and it's kind of cosmopolitan for the 1930s, I think you'll be surprised, was milk orno polenta with tomato sauce, where you make milk orno, or milk guido, or milk odo, whatever you're lucky enough to have, and then you put a little tomato sauce on it, and there you have a very nutritious and kind of Italian meal. And they had milk orno cakes. I mean, they did everything with it. And they're giving it away. The relief agencies are giving away bags of milk orno, milk guido, milk odo. But I think this is something that really got associated with the hard times, and we don't see a revival of it yet. I'm waiting, hoping. And even more excitingly for the home economists who thought they were going to save the world was that in 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt served milk orno at the White House. And she made a big deal of it, and she had the press in so that they could see the first family eating milk orno. And apparently, FDR did not like it at all. So it had just kind of one appearance and then vanished. She created menus that were based on what ordinary people would be able to eat, and she publicized that she was going to do that. She served, for a couple of weeks, she served very simple, what they called budget meals, except that she was not allowed to serve them to foreign visitors or to dignitaries, just to the family. I'll just tell you one of those menus. Let's see, or maybe I won't. So I guess not. I guess I haven't included that, but I remember definitely that it included stewed prunes, that was the treat, brown bread and stewed prunes, which you can imagine would have gone over very well Very good for American diplomacy, at least. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was this kind of circus-like event that was known as the Slaughter of the Little Pigs, which you're probably familiar with. In 1933, the federal government established a thing called the Federal Surplus Redistribution Corporation, which was to take the surplus and give it to people who needed it, which makes a lot of sense, right? You've got farmers overproducing milk and corn and, in this case, pigs, and you've got people who can't eat, so you want to get the food to the people as quickly as possible. A kind of wonderful idea. And what happens is a disaster. They decide that what they need to do is not just take care of too many pigs this year, but take care of the fact that there are going to be too many pigs next year too. So the way that you do this is a little gruesome. I hope that they're not easily offended vegetarians. I'm not advocating doing this, but I'm just saying, this is what happened. What you do is you kill pregnant pigs and you kill young pigs. So they round up what were called piggy sows, sows that had piglets in them, and young pigs. And you take them all to the slaughterhouses, and you push them into the slaughterhouses, and you start the machines going. But all of the machinery of the meat processing facilities were for adult male pigs. So what happens is that pigs get out, and the streets of Chicago, well, I'm exaggerating here, but it's such a great image. The streets of Chicago fill with these little piglets on the loose, and everybody knows how cute piglets are, right? So all these people who live around the factories are rescuing the pigs and probably eating them later themselves. But the pigs become these kind of folk heroes. The little pigs are being slaughtered. And this can't happen, and how is the government letting this happen? And the fact is that the government is letting it happen because there are people starving, right? Which is the other problem, slightly bigger than the problem with the small pigs running away. So it's this huge public relations disaster, and the agency can never really recover from this, and this is its first big big attempt to feed people. So what's happened is that because agriculture and because food production has already by the 1930s become so mechanized, you can't just kill the pigs that you need. You can only kill the pigs that the system is set up to kill. So this is, again, very, very gruesome story. And then they have lots of milk, but it's really hard in the 1930s to get milk anywhere because refrigeration is not common. So they end up spilling gallons of milk just in ditches, and this is seen as the government wasting while people are going hungry, which is not what they're intending to do. Okay, and just one other thing that I wanted to say about food during the Depression is that this is the moment, in 1931, the federal government pays for a study of what Americans eat. And this is the first time that our diets are studied, looking for our budgets and nutrition. So this is the first major study of how we eat as Americans, and I know this is something that's more and more interesting every day as we have these obesity epidemics and all of this. But this is the beginning of looking at that. So this is a really, really important moment in American food history. And I think I'll stop there because I get really tired of talking. So if you have questions, then I'll sort of, here. Yeah.
To hear you talk about some of the foods that people had to eat makes me feel that I grew up in luxury. We did have, I grew up on a farm, and we had animals, we had chickens and so forth.
Yes, okay, so right. Sorry, this is another thing. So this listener, I'm gonna, I'm sorry. Yeah, repeat the question. Not so much a question, but she's saying that to hear what people had to eat, she feels like she grew up in luxury, that they had animals, that they had enough to eat, and yeah.
But what we didn't have was money.
Right.
And there was and living in the country, there was a lot of there was a lot of sharing.
Yes. So this is a moment when people returned in a way to a pre-currency system. So a friend had told me about his grandfather who was a dentist in a small town in Wisconsin, and the people had food, but they didn't have money, so they pay the dentist with chickens. And this is actually a pretty good thing for the dentist during the Depression. Another woman told a story about living on a dairy farm, and so it's sort of the opposite, that they couldn't pay their bills, so they pay in cream. And then one week they're taking the cream to market and all the cream spills, and they have to just do without for that entire week. Yeah, so those who lived on farms that were producing and that produced the kinds of things that people could eat could survive as long as they could figure out how to trade with other people. Yeah, it was much harder on people in urban areas and industrial areas. Yeah, and a lot of people at this point whose farms had turned over to single crops went back to trying to raise enough food for their families, to making small gardens just to feed those around them. Yeah, that's really, really important, that it goes away from a currency economy to back to barter, essentially. Yeah. Oh,
I just had a
yeah,
question.
yeah.
People who are smuggling food,
Mm-hmm.
were there stiff penalties for that? Did you find any evidence?
If, yeah, by losing your job, you mean stiff penalty, yeah.
Were they imprisoned or?
No, typically, if she was asking were there penalties for smuggling food, and basically what would happen is you would lose your job, which is the worst thing that could happen to you if you had a job like this. Yeah, I mean, people did all kinds of illegal things. Kids stole from market stalls. Their moms would send them out to steal because cops would be less tough on a kid. Mothers sent their children to knock on doors and beg, just because people would respond better to kids than to adults. Yeah, it's kind of lawless, right? Yeah.
And sometimes with large families, some of the young men would ride the rails and get off the
Right,
train
right.
and ride to different towns, and when the train would stop, they'd get off and go to their house.
And this is what Jacob is thinking is going to happen to him, right? That he's going to become a hobo. That before the Depression, there was a kind of sizable population of people, mostly young men, who just rode the rails, who just didn't want to fit into society and traveled around. And then in the Depression, that population just mushrooms. It becomes huge. And it begins to include young women as well. People who are just going to travel from town to town trying to find food, going knocking on doors, stealing, then going on. There's, not quite, they don't get quite the wonderful things that Jacob's friends do when they steal from laundry lines in the circus. Do you remember when somebody shows up with a tuxedo? I can't imagine a tuxedo on a laundry line. But that you would just travel around trying to get what you could. There's a great book called Boxcar Bertha. I don't know if any of you know that book. It's the true story, she would say, of a woman who traveled during this period, who just lived on the trains. And she was known as Boxcar Bertha because she lived on the trains. Yeah.
Did you find incidents? I know my uncles were all kind of given away to other families
Yeah.
to work on their farms, and they were really kind of like slave labor. They weren't making really money, but their own family didn't have to feed them. They were
Right.
getting food. But what that did to the family, I mean, to this day, my one uncle is in his 90s, but he had so many emotional issues from that,
Yeah.
and it was really hard for him to attach to a family later.
Right. Did everybody hear this? That uncles young family members were given away during the Depression. If a family couldn't support their kids, they would send them to other family members who could. Her uncles were given away to farm relatives.
Not even relatives.
Not even
Just
relatives.
farmers.
Just
Yeah,
farmers.
yeah.
So they were given away, as she's saying, as slave labor, and presumably fed, which would be their parents' idea. And yeah, this was very common for families who couldn't afford to feed their children to give them to somebody that they thought could. There's a Russell Baker's memoir that came out many, many years ago. I think it's called Hard Times or something like that. It tells the story of his sister Audrey, who was given away and then became in a way like a cousin, that family relationships really, really changed. And it's not just kids who are being given away, but a lot of men just left their families during the Depression because they couldn't provide, and that's what they thought they were supposed to do. So rather than fail at that, they just left and therefore didn't provide at all. So you get a lot of women-headed households during the 30s, and that when you get to the 50s, there's this flip back, right, that you don't want women in charge of the household because that's a sign of these really tough times, of the deprivation of the 30s. So that June Cleaver, who seems so ominous today, right, that she had a reason, in a sense, as a reaction to the Depression. maybe not ominous, shouldn't exaggerate. Yeah.
My, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, my stepmother, her mother had passed away, she was like 2 years old, and there were four of them, and their dad, you know, he didn't have a job, he couldn't feed them, so he put them in an orphanage.
Oh, yeah.
And they grew up in an orphanage, and he would come on Sunday and bring a basket with a little bit of food in it, and spend Sunday afternoon with them, and then go back and work.
Wow.
And it just seemed real, like it really affected her so bad.
Yeah, again, this breaking up of families, that the father in this case couldn't support the family, so he put all of the children in an orphanage, and he would visit them every Sunday and talk to them, and then go away and work for them again. So he's trying to stay connected, and also what an orphan was. That definition has really changed a lot over time. If you go back into the 19th century, a lot of orphans were just people whose folks couldn't support them. Or one parent couldn't support them. Yeah, so there's a lot of disruption of family. And again, I think that kind of accounts for the mania for family in the 50s. I mean, partly the disruption of the war as well, but the experience of the 30s affects the ideal family in the 50s, right? They all stay together, dad provides, the family's big, they have a lot of room, they always eat. Yeah, and we're still kind of dealing with that fallout, I think. Yes.
My mother has shared with me many times her memories as a small child growing up in North Boygan, New Jersey, that they ate nothing but potatoes
Right.
for the longest time. And the parents, you know, in order to satiate the kids and give them something to do, would hand them a potato. Neighborhood kids would gather in the winter and, you know, build a fire and stick these potatoes in the coals of the fire and stand around warming their hands and talking and anticipating these potatoes being done, and then she would describe them as being completely charred, you know, but then being steaming hot in the middle, and if they were lucky, they might have butter to put on it. That was a luxury.
Oh yeah, butter was really hard to get.
Yeah, but, you know, and how getting something like an orange or something was like getting candy. It was just, you know, nothing but potatoes. for the longest
Nothing
time.
but potatoes, right? That's things like that, the most basic staple, the cheapest thing, and really easy to transport. You're not going to worry about a potato going bad. If you have too many potatoes, you can just pile them up somewhere. Actually, one of my favorite Depression era recipes is potato candy, which it predates the Depression, but it became really popular, where you mash potato and you put a little sugar in it if you have it, and then if you're really lucky and you have some peanut butter, you can put peanut butter on top, and then you roll it up and slice it like sushi. It's pretty glamorous. You should try it. I've tried all these things.
I'd like to know too, I know that the Depression began in 1929, stock market
Mhm.
crashed. What year or so would you say really ends what's referred to as the Depression?
Yeah, it really ends. It ends around 1939 when we start mobilizing to supply the Allies. So towards the end of 1939, yeah. So before America gets involved, we get involved in supplying, and that means industrial jobs. And industrial jobs means money, and money means money to farmers, and you know you begin to be able to pay your dentist with something other than a chicken. The big shift. Yeah. But yeah, none of the programs ended it. It was the war, because it had become an industrial economy by then, and I don't know what would have happened if it had gone on. Maybe we would have gone back to chicken dental care exchange. Which, if you think about HMOs now, I just love the idea of delivering a chicken to my health care. There you go. Maybe I'll try.
Sounds good.
Doesn't it? Anything else? Oh, yep.
We're talking about a lot of the positive effects that the Depression had on like family unity, like the
Positive? I don't know.
well, as in like people trying to come together as a family, being prideful and stuff about bringing food home and things like that. But I was wondering if there were any extremely negative effects. And I'm sorry. if
Yeah,
it's a little-
no, I think the pride was a big problem, that it prevented people from getting their families fed. And I mean, obviously the pride of a man you know, he can't feed his family and that hurts his pride, so he leaves. It's really going to be devastating for the family, for him, for society eventually. Yeah, I don't see so many good effects of the Depression, I have to say. Except for that potato candy recipe. It's a winner.
Today's
Yeah.
focus on spending as little as possible on food. You know, getting the cheap noodles and all that. Does that tend to stem from that Depression time or from some time between the Depression and now? Where
You-
did that sort of start?
Oh, what are you talking about? Trying to get?
Like today, we have a focus on spending as small of our paycheck as possible at the grocery store.
Right.
You know, people don't sort of pride themselves on spending a lot on groceries.
Uh-huh.
But that,
Remember, I live in New York.
at least here.
Yeah.
But that focus on sort of buying the cheapest food possible, does that come from that Depression time? Or from a
Well,
later
I think people have always wanted to spend as little as they could, but it became more possible during the Depression when and we were talking about this before, I forgot to bring this up, that before the Depression you had little family-run grocery stores, you had a lot of them in every neighborhood, they catered to ethnic communities, and they were set up where there's a counter and all the stuff is behind the counter and you have the grocer and his helpers, you go into the store, you ask for stuff, they get it for you, you have an account. And everybody got their groceries on credit, basically. So during the Depression, all these groceries begin to struggle more and more as people can't pay their bills, and they cut off the credit. And big chain groceries that had kind of started in the 20s get a big boost during the Depression because they can rent space for cheap, big spaces, and they can get a lot of stuff for cheap because there's all the surplus on the market. And the relief agencies, the government relief agencies, start giving out coupons, in a sense, for the big groceries. So the little groceries are getting hurt by this. And the little groceries, the grocery owners fight back and they say, this isn't fair to us, you have to give people checks that they can use anywhere. And so the government changes their policy, but in the meantime, people have discovered that if you go to a big grocery where you can get the stuff yourself, so you're not paying for the person to take the stuff down for you, you can get them for cheaper. So if you go to a big grocer, you get it for cheap. If you go to a small grocer, it's more expensive. And this is kind of the end of the little grocers and the move to the big supermarkets, except in New York where people will love to pay more for everything, it seems. Anything else?
What's your thought on when the train would pull into a town, where would they get that food so quick for that like small army of people?
In the circus?
Yeah, would they go to these big grocery stores?
No.
Because they didn't have much money either.
Yeah.
Where did they get all that food so fast? Which is
Boy, that's tough. I don't know. I mean, that would be really hard, yeah.
They just go in there and then all of a sudden the flag.
Oh, magic,
they
right?
have all this food.
Yeah, I suspect that they would send advance people to buy up whatever people have. I mean, there is surplus. If you have money, you can get whatever you want. There's not a scarcity. It's just a problem of getting food to people. So if you have the money, if this, you know, and he has money, the guy who runs the circus, right? He just doesn't share it with his employees, except in the form of food. But that's a good question. I don't know how you would do that kind of thing. Yeah.
In the book, they talk about having advance agents that set up the food and the
Right.
venue and the posters, and that those advance agents were always in front of the train.
Right.
They had it prearranged.
That sounds right. And that would probably endear them to the town a little bit too, if they come in with a lot of money and buy a lot of stuff. Yeah.
I thought one of the sadder parts of the movie,
It does read like
There's a
a
movie in my mind I was reading. Was the part where the starving guy who was not a paid member of the circus was turned away and he was starving and had eaten
Yeah.
2 days. That is kind of a sad.
Yeah, she's talking about the part where somebody's turned away from the circus and he's starving, and you know that he's just going to end up dead, right, in a ditch somewhere. And this is why they hang
I
on.
can see where the crime rate, would maybe have been pretty horrendous during that time period because you'd be driven to it,
Yeah, definitely petty theft went up a lot. And people really kind of turned away. Police didn't enforce laws against that as much. Yeah. Yeah, but it's hard to remember that people really literally starved, that they didn't eat and died. Grim. We need to talk about something more happy. Elephants are happy. I don't know. What else? Yeah.
My question is, what lasting effect did this nutritional deprivation have on the children?
I don't know. I'm not a nutritionist. I wish I knew. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I just think that a lot of families, I know my mom had 6 children and grew up in a large family with like 5 or 6 children, Catholic, 8 in some families, and even after all the children left, she still supplied the house with food. We had like 6 children, we would have to go and explain to her that you really don't need to fill the pantry with food for 2 people anymore.
Yeah, it had a profound effect on how people thought about food. I don't know what it did to their actual physiques. I mean, there's stories like this of this woman's family where the mother keeps providing food even when there are no more children in the house, and the opposite. You have lots of stories of families where the food is hoarded, where people don't want to. Yeah, exactly. And you just want to always, if there are leftovers at a restaurant, you have to take them home and save them for a week and feed them, everybody with this obsessive protection of food. And then other people react. I mean, it's like the noodles versus the onion sandwich story. Yeah.
I think I can relate to that, the hoarding. My mom did a lot of that too. We're buying huge amounts of things that we didn't need because someday you might.
Exactly, as if you could store up for it.
The other part of it is I had an adopted aunt and uncle who were Greek, and they lived in Chicago during the Depression. And part of it was cultural, but part of it I think was from living through the Depression because it was like eat. She didn't eat. She ran around, just giving you more food.
And that's a little European mama type thing, right?
Yeah, a little of that, but I think also just when food is there, you eat it.
Yes, because you
Because it
never
might
know.
not be there tomorrow.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It might this idea that it's hard, I think, for some of us now to relate to, that everything could change overnight. It could all disappear. You won't have anything to eat. That really lasted for people in a really profound way. Oh, again, yes, sorry.
You're a historian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you think that given the current situation in terms of our overuse of resources and the greater division of rich and poor, do you think this could happen again in this country?
I don't know. It's really hard to say because we now have the FDIC, so we won't have the bank failures that we had. I mean, things are not looking so good right now. But that problem is probably not going to happen again. The distribution issue, it's hard to say. I mean, I think it's more our distribution problem is more what happens when we run out of fuel to get stuff to people, because that's how most of us get our food, is it's trucked in from somewhere really, really far away. So that I see as an issue, but I don't know that I can imagine everything collapsing in the same way. But history it repeats itself over and over and over. So, yeah. What do you think?
I think in response to that, there will be a sustainable culture. There's always going to be subcultures and different groups that are going to already be prepared and have, their necessary items provided for, sugar.
So can we have your address and come over when
But it's not me.
she's offering us a sustainable future?
I'm the one that comes by and visits. I'm not the one.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
There is a consciousness to eat local.
And there's definitely a growing awareness of this problem of huge single crop farms, and that it might be good to be able to eat locally, to have the variety to eat locally. But for us, the big problem is that we're used to a lot more variety than they had during the Depression. If you look at a relief list, so this is a receipt for supplies that a family was given. This is from Alabama from 1934. They got half a pound of meal, 2 boxes of oatmeal, 5 cans of milk, 10 pounds of sweet potatoes, 4 pounds of dried beans, 7 ounces of tomatoes, 7 ounce canned tomatoes, 6 pounds of cabbage, which I think 6 pounds of cabbage would be too much for any American family today. I'm not cabbage eaters. 3 pounds of dried fruit, 3 pounds of onions, 6 pounds of lard, a gallon of molasses, 4 pounds of meat, so that's more lard than meat, 1 box of salt, and 1 box of soda. And we want more than that now, you know, that's not, people wouldn't be happy with that, right?
How often would they
That is, I think that's a month's worth of food there, yeah. Right, yeah, I mean, this is the other huge problem, is our huge portions that we're just, you know, it's too much food, really. It's the opposite.
You think in some ways it's just today, I mean, we certainly have poor people who are starving to death in this country today. It's not something that's
Oh, yeah,
gone
it's
away.
not over, right.
It's just a much smaller segment of society. And during the Depression, I suspect there were those who didn't suffer, who had money and
Oh,
could
yeah.
get whatever they wanted. As you said, it wasn't an issue of scarcity
Right.
of product, it was scarcity of income.
Yeah,
And I think, you know, maybe we should think about the people today who are in those conditions every day.
right, that there are still, I don't know if you heard what this man is saying, that there are, you know, that the problem of starvation and hunger has certainly not gone away. I mean, there are, you know, lots and lots of people who don't have enough to eat. In every community, there are school programs where there are significant numbers of kids who, you know, who qualify for the school lunch program, and a lot of them who aren't eating the lunch program because of this issue of pridefulness that can really get in the way. Yeah, and to think about hunger and starvation as something that doesn't go away of its own accord, you know, and that there's and there are other issues that food is getting to people, but it's not the right kind of food, you know, which is almost as big a problem. But nothing is as big a problem as real hunger and starvation.
I was
Yeah.
gonna ask them if you know, the depression gave rise to the industrial revolution type of thing, and also the mass production of very highly refined food products, which are nutritionally not complete, which then, of course, is giving rise to the obesity problem. You know, because I mean, we do have segments of the society who they can afford to buy the hamburger helper or the
Stretcher.
yeah, the instant noodles, that kind of thing, that they can't afford to go to the farmer's market and buy fresh vegetables or to shop the perimeter of the store where the natural foods are. It's a lot more expensive to eat that way.
Right, and it takes more time too. If you're working
Yeah.
4 jobs,
Right.
you know, kale may look nice to you, but
Yeah.
do you have time for kale? No.
Yeah. Yeah. But
Yeah.
most people can't afford to buy it. When you start to eat
Hmm.
the natural foods and that kind of thing, your grocery bill goes up tremendously.
It does.
And of course, it's a worthwhile investment, but you know, it's great if you can afford it. If
Right.
you can't afford it, you're kind of messed up. So I'm wondering, you know, this poverty that began, this severe poverty that began, and then the industrialization that occurred as the wars came on. You know, I guess I'm wondering, does that directly coincide with the big growth of mass production?
Mass production had started
Refined
before,
foods.
yeah, long before that. So you've got mass-produced stuff beginning in the 1920s, and along with it, advertisement, which has a lot to do with how people buy, you know, how people eat what they eat. But the kind of the process, the over-processed stuff, I shouldn't say over, but very, very heavily processed stuff, comes in the early 1950s, late 1940s with the car culture. That, you know, the fast food you're eating in the car, and people get excited about that, and it's the great new thing, and then you kind of want everything that way, that like, oh, we can just rip open a pouch and the whole family will be fed in half a second. And it seemed really exciting to people at first, that they didn't have to think about food. And if you think about those 10 years of the Depression, when all you can think about is what are you going to eat? Is it going to be a dandelion or are you going to get a potato? That was very attractive to have it all ready made. That when the food scientists came up with these exciting things, people wanted it. Yeah, but there's a lot more going on there than I think I can even cover. Yeah. Yeah.
The nutrition research.
Oh, I can hear you.
The nutrition research in agricultural colleges
Right.
happened in the 1930s.
Yeah.
The original work on vitamin B's.
Right. Vitamin research and nutritional research began in the 20s and 30s.
In the 20s and 30s.
Uh-huh.
And so it was happening. And to go back to the list of groceries
Mhm.
that the Alabama family got, if they lived on a farm, they would also have greens and other things.
Yeah, you notice that what's missing from that list, by our standards, is fresh greens, right? A lot of people weren't interested in fresh greens in the 20s and 30s. It wasn't something that people thought of as,
But they did.
worth eating, that animals ate those
But
sorts of
they did
things.
in the South, did they not?
They ate, yeah, cooked up greens, definitely, yeah. But this relief family, or this list of items that this family is getting, that's probably not people who live on a farm. So that's including the tomatoes that they would have canned themselves. And this is another thing that home economists do during the Depression, is they go out and they tell people how to take care of their food, so that if you've got a lot of tomatoes now, you can also have a lot of tomatoes in February, and it's not something that comes naturally to people. They don't know how to just can stuff and keep it. It's difficult, as Julie and I were talking about. It's hard to do. Oh, there you are. Good. Oh, good. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for everything.
I just want to thank everybody again for coming out. I'm Julie Bach. I'm with KOPN 89.5 FM, and I also want to thank the Daniel Boone Regional Library. And I also really want to thank the Cherry Street Artisan for allowing us to use this great venue and being a sponsor of this program. And make sure that if you bought something, you tip the bar. I'm sure they'd appreciate it. And feel free to stick around and have another beverage or whatever. And I believe they have a band coming on later if you want to stay and enjoy the music. So thank you again for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next One Read event, and tune us in on KOPN, and we've got a lot of other great programming coming up this month. Thank you.